Here you go, sir. One scoop of Geography King.
Howdy, it's Kyle with a video discussing the best way to road trip through the Four Corners states. If you're interested in doing a road trip that is largely outdoors oriented, this is the best one you can do. There are a lot of national parks, a lot of national monuments, huge canyons, desert landscapes, alpine landscapes, ancient Pueblo Indian sites, and even a few big cities to go along with it. There's just so much variety to see in a relatively small area. You won't have to drive a whole lot between spots that we're stopping at. I've done this route a few times, and it's my personal favorite way to go if I'm doing a road trip where I'll be doing a lot of camping and hiking. In this video, I want to go over some of the highlights, the best spots you want to see if you only have a week, other areas you'll want to stop at if you have 2 or 3 weeks, and also some areas you can just go ahead and skip. The Four Corners states are Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And this is a pretty popular road trip route. You'll often see it referred to as the Grand Circle, as the route ends up looking kind of like a circle as it goes around a bunch of national parks. But I do want to discuss why it's actually better and why you'll get more out of it if you do this trip in a route shaped like a C. If you're coming from west of this area, the route will end up looking like a circle, but most people live east of here, and it is better to do the route shaped like a C as opposed to the typical circle you'll see referenced in the mainstream websites and travel books. You can do the C-shaped route in either a clockwise or a counterclockwise direction. In this video, I'm going to describe it going in a clockwise direction, but it doesn't really matter. You can go the other way too. If you're coming from the east, you'll likely be entering New Mexico along Interstate 40. And if you're looking to stay somewhere in a city before you hit the national parks, I strongly recommend Santa Fe. It's not along I-40, it's about 45 minutes north of the interstate, but definitely worth the diversion. It's a historic city. It's the second oldest city in the country. Only St. Augustine, Florida is older. But Santa Fe, a lot of fun. Got a great historic square, some cool shops and restaurants, just a lot of charm. Albuquerque is a pretty cool city too, but it is a much bigger city. It doesn't quite have the same charm as Santa Fe. If you have more than 2 weeks to complete this road trip, one diversion I can recommend is when you get to Gallup, New Mexico, go northwest into the northeastern corner of Arizona and Canyon de Chelly National Monument. It's a lot less visited than the national parks, but it's a great spot to stop, some nice hiking trails. After that, you'll drive across Monument Valley, which is some of the most iconic southwestern scenery you'll see, and you'll end up near Flagstaff. And if you only have a week or two to do this route, I don't recommend taking this diversion, but if you do have more than 2 weeks, check it out. There are 3 national monuments that are all pretty close to Flagstaff: Sunset Crater, Wupatki, and Walnut Canyon. And even if you only have 2 weeks or less to complete this road trip, I can certainly recommend stopping at all 3. Wupatki and Sunset Crater are adjacent to each other, and you can easily see both of these in one day, as each only has a few short hiking trails and a pretty cool short drive through it. You can also include Walnut Canyon on the same day as well. It'd be a long day, and it's definitely worth checking out, but you can see some pretty cool ancient Pueblo Indian sites and cliff dwellings that are really close to the interstate and major highways without having to go too far off the road to see them. All right, so here's where this video is going to get controversial. If you're doing this road trip, I recommend skipping both Petrified Forest and, yes, the Grand Canyon. I said it, skip the Grand Canyon. And here's why. A short visit to the Grand Canyon involves going to the visitor center, driving the main road through the park, and stopping at some of the viewpoints to get pictures. But the crowds are so large, you'll have to shank a few old ladies or push a couple little kids into the canyon just to get a nice view. But the reason why I say to skip it isn't just because of the crowds. It's because you can see better scenery, better canyon country landscapes in other parts along this route. And later in this video, I'll talk about these places where you can see stuff better than the Grand Canyon. But here's a hint, it's written on my shirt. In order to really get a good feel for the Grand Canyon, you'll have to spend at least 2-3 days or more there. And if you're on a 2-week long road trip, I can't recommend spending 2 or 3 days at the Grand Canyon. And Petrified Forest is even more disappointing. A short visit there, you're going to get nothing out of it. If you don't have the chance to get back into the backcountry, into the Painted Desert, you're going to be very underwhelmed. So yeah, you heard me say it, skip both these national parks. To get from northern Arizona to southwestern Utah, you'll have a couple different options. You can take US and state highways north of the Grand Canyon on into the area around Zion National Park. That'll take you through the interesting towns of Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale, Utah. They're not as creepy as they used to be since that cult leader guy has been arrested, but as the old folks would say, mind your P's and Q's going through that town. Probably not the best place to test out the top speed of your car, so just, be careful going through there. Or you can stay mainly on the interstates, and when you get to Kingman, Arizona, you can head northwest into fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. And of course, Vegas is a complete antithesis of all of the national parks and outdoor scenery and all the camping and hiking and stuff. But even if you're morally opposed to gambling and against all the debauchery that goes on in Vegas, or even if you're strictly doing an outdoors trip and don't want to do anything city oriented, I do strongly recommend driving up and down the Las Vegas Strip, especially if it's at night. It's just so unique. It's such a unique slice of America, and it's worth checking out. So, but either way, you're going to end up in southwestern Utah near Zion National Park. Zion is great. Even if you're only doing a 2-week road trip, I can recommend spending at least 2 days there. There's just a whole lot of variety, a lot of great stuff to see. It'll either be the first of the 5 or the last of the 5 national parks in Utah you visit, depending on the direction you're going. And it is a very popular national park, so don't expect a whole lot of solitude there unless you're going to get way back into the backcountry. And if you're visiting between May and September, you'll have to use the shuttle to get through the park. And a lot of folks don't like this, but it actually is very convenient. You don't have to worry about where to park. You don't have to worry about crashing your car from oohing and awing at the scenery. And it stops at all the major trailhead areas and at the lodge and really anywhere you're going to want to stop in the park. And Zion's also one of the very few national parks where you can reserve a campsite. Most are first come, first serve. So if you are going to be camping at the Watchman Campground, try to reserve site D20 or D19. These are definitely the 2 best sites in the campground. They're the most spacious, and you get a really nice view of the Watchman behind it. So yeah, Zion, definitely not a spot you're going to want to skip. A short 2-hour drive from Zion is Bryce Canyon National Park, and this is another one where you're not going to want to skip. And unlike the Grand Canyon, Bryce is more suited for a short visit. So if you're doing a 2-week road trip, you can get a whole lot out of Bryce in just 1 day. You will still just drive the main road through the park and stop at the viewpoints to get pictures of some of the different spots, but you'll have a lot more variation between the viewpoints, and you'll also have a lot more opportunities to do short hikes off the main road without having to hike down into the canyon. So it is better suited for a short visit. One thing to note, though, is that it is at a much higher elevation than anywhere else on this route. So you'll be at around 10,000 feet. So if you're visiting in the spring, it's still going to be really cold and probably snowy at Bryce, even though it might be brutally hot at Zion or some of the other parks. And if you're visiting in the fall, it might be perfect weather at other areas, but it still might be pretty cold at Bryce. And even during the summer, when you're at 10,000 feet, you just never know. It could snow at any time. So just be prepared for that. Make sure you bring your cold weather clothes. But yeah, Bryce, don't skip it. Heading east out of Bryce Canyon, the next national park you'll approach is Capitol Reef. It's by far the least visited of the 5 national parks in Utah. If you're coming from LA or Phoenix, you can do Zion and Bryce in a long weekend. If you're coming from Denver, you can do Arches and Canyonlands in a long weekend. But Capitol Reef's right in the middle and therefore the least visited. And it's also my personal favorite of the 5 Utah national parks, and not from a hipster point of view like, oh, it's the least visited, so therefore it's the best, but because you can access the backcountry much more easily here than the other parks. There are a lot of gravel and dirt roads you can take to get way back there, and you won't need a really high clearance vehicle. You won't need like a monster truck or a Hummer to get back there. We were able to do it in a Subaru Forester, so I wouldn't do it in a Corvette, but you can get to some pretty cool backcountry without having to do any kind of crazy off-roading. There's a lot of good variety in short hikes there, which is another reason why I like it. And the coloring at Capitol Reef is just so gorgeous. I mean, I love the sandstone formations all throughout this region, but the colors at Capitol Reef are just so much more vibrant. And even if you're not going to stop at Capitol Reef, you are going to drive through it just by doing this route. The main road goes right through the park. So if you are going to do a 2-week road trip, I recommend spending a day there. And if you're doing a longer road trip, spend a couple days there. Capitol Reef, really cool spot to visit. Following the route out of Capitol Reef, you'll end up in Moab, Utah. Moab is the gateway to both Arches and Canyonlands national parks. It's a pretty small town, but it has a couple of grocery stores, some restaurants, and some boutique type stores if you want to do some shopping. It can get overrun with tourists during the summertime, but because it is so heavily visited, it also has a lot more services and amenities than you might expect of a town of its size. It even has a microbrewery, so if you aren't going to be camping, it's a really convenient place to stay to be able to hit both the nearby national parks. Arches National Park is really close to Moab, and the main entrance is right off the main highway into town. It's a very heavily visited national park, as most of the main sites are easily accessed from the main road through the park. So you'll drive through, stop at the big parking lots, and get out and not have to walk very far to see some of the main sites. When people think of Arches, they're probably thinking of Delicate Arch first. It's one of the most iconic sites in the entire Southwest. It's the Utah state symbol. It's on the Utah state quarter, and it's just really well known. But the reality is that it's a very popular hike, and a lot of people see it. If you want to be able to see this site without the crowds, what I strongly recommend is doing it really early in the morning, even getting to the park before sunrise. You hit the trail right about sunrise, and by the time you get to the arch, there really won't be anybody there. There might not be anybody there at all, and it just makes it for a much more peaceful visit. It's a pretty easy hike, even though it is kind of uphill all the way going, but it's pretty short. A lot of it's on exposed rock, so don't do it if there's a thunderstorm coming, but it is a pretty easy trail in terms of, terrain difficulty. And because it's uphill going in and downhill going back, it's really not that difficult. And again, do it really early in the morning and you won't have to deal with the crowds. There is a lot of backcountry arches and a lot of off-road driving sections, but I haven't been back to any of it, being that Canyonlands is right next door and that's just all backcountry. So I haven't had the time to see it at Arches. But if you do want to see a lot of Arches without having to deal with the tour bus crowds, one trail I can recommend is the Devil's Garden Trail. It's not very difficult. It's a few miles and you'll see a whole lot of Arches, but not a whole lot of people. If you do the Delicate Arch Trail first thing in the morning, then say do the Devil's Garden Trail a little bit after that, you can drive back through the park and stop at some of the more popular spots, especially the window section. And even if you do all of that, you'll be back in Moab by the late afternoon. You can check out the town a little bit, get some rest, and then see Canyonlands the next day. One interesting phenomenon is that Arches and Canyonlands are both really close to each other, but Arches is really packed and Canyonlands is not. It's one of the lesser visited national parks. I'm not really sure why. It has a lot more backcountry than any of the parks in this area, and there's just so much to see, so much to explore. I'm not sure if people think that, maybe we don't have to see Canyonlands because we can see all that at Grand Canyon and we can go ahead and skip it. And I would say the exact opposite. Like I said before, go ahead and skip the Grand Canyon because you can see the same scenery without the crowds at Canyonlands. In my opinion, the best canyon country viewpoint in the entire region is the Grand Viewpoint next to the Willow Flat Campground. It's a great spot. There's a big parking lot there, but I've never seen that many cars there. If you go early in the morning or later in the afternoon, you'll avoid the tour buses that might show up. It's just a great spot to sit. It's peaceful, and you won't have to deal with the hordes of crowds that you would see at the Grand Canyon. And it's right next again to the Willow Flat Campground, which is first come, first serve, but I've never had a problem getting a site there. Even in August during the high season, we were able to pull up and get a site. So if you are looking to camp, it is a good spot to camp, and you're right next to a great viewpoint. Unlike the Grand Canyon, there are a lot more short day hikes that are easily accessed from the main road through the park. I've done a bunch of these hikes, and I've never seen a big crowd on any of them. So it's a good way to get away from the crowds without having to get way back into backcountry or do really long hikes. But if you do want to go way back in the backcountry at one spot somewhere on this trip, I do recommend doing it at Canyonlands. There's just so much there and just great areas to get lost if you're looking to do that. If you're starting your road trip from somewhere in the Eastern or Central time zone, you'll likely be driving across Colorado on Interstate 70. That'll take you right through Denver. So if you want to do a little bit of city stuff, Denver's a great place to stop. There's a lot of stuff to do there. And about 2 hours north of Denver is Rocky Mountain National Park. This isn't considered normally part of the Grand Circle tour that most of the tour guides and books will tell you about. But if you're coming again from the east, you'll be driving through this part of Colorado, and why not see one more national park that'll let you see even more variety and some beautiful alpine landscapes. If you don't want to stay in Denver and you don't want to camp, you can stay in the gateway town of Estes Park. I've been there in October and the place was overrun with tourists. I can't imagine how this town can even function during the summertime, but either way, it's still worth visiting Rocky Mountain National Park. And that essentially completes the C-shaped route that I recommend you take if you're doing a road trip to this part of the country. You may have noticed that I didn't mention a lot of places, a lot of state parks, some national monuments, and even a couple of national parks. But that's because on a 2 or even a 3 week road trip, you can't see it all. You have to make cuts somewhere. And even if you have, say, a month or more to do this road trip, I still don't recommend seeing some of the spots I did not mention because, say, you do have a month and you're coming from the East Coast or the South or the Midwest or something, if you're going to do other stuff, I recommend seeing things outside of this region, such as maybe Yellowstone or Grand Teton National Parks in Wyoming, or maybe the Badlands and Black Hills in South Dakota, or say Carlsbad Caverns in southeast New Mexico, or Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas. So if you do have even longer time, I recommend seeing areas outside of this region as opposed to completely scouring this region and seeing it all. One place that is almost always mentioned on your typical Grand Circle tour route is Mesa Verde National Park in southwestern Colorado. And this is a great spot. You'll see more ancient Pueblo Indian sites and cliff dwellings here than anywhere else. But unless that's the main intent of your road trip, I think you'll get more out of this entire trip if you see this ancient sites between the combination of Lupatki and Walnut Canyon in Arizona. Mesa Verde is pretty far out of the way. It's a half a day drive to get there. You'll want to spend a day there, another half a day drive to get back to wherever else you're going. So you really have to want to see that as the main point of your trip to go out of the way to see it. And if your main intent is to see the scenery and do some of the hiking and do some camping, I think it's just better to see the smaller sites, see some pretty cool ancient sites, even though you won't see as many at Mesa Verde. One place I want to specifically discourage going to if you are doing this road trip is the actual Four Corners spot. I guess the appeal is to lay on the ground doing the snow angel thing, thinking you got one limb in each state, but it's not even in the right spots. People have been doing that for years, thinking they're in all 4 states at once, but they're not. But it's pretty far out of the way, and it's just not something that's worth seeing. It's not like it's free either. You have to pay to do it, and you'll get a lot more out of it if you actually do something in each of the 4 states as opposed to just laying on the ground thinking you're in all 4 states at once. And I hate to use the word waste, but if you're only doing a 2 week road trip, it really is a waste to take that much time out just to do that. So I can't really recommend it. I also want to highly recommend picking up this book, Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. It's a great read. It's wonderfully written. I don't even read much. I'm not a novel reader at all. I like pictures, but it'll really enhance your visit to this region. It's just a great book. You can pick it up at any of the national park visitor centers, which is kind of ironic since a lot of the book is ripping on the National Park Service, but you can also, I'm sure, get it at your local library and you can download it for an e-reader. I can't do the e-reader thing, it hurts my eyes, but anyway, definitely pick it up. It's a great book and it really will enhance your trip to this whole region. So those are my recommendations on the best way to do a road trip through the Four Corners states. You can visit 10 travel websites and read 10 travel books, and you'll see 35 different ways on how to complete this route. But I've done it a few times, and I think I've got some good ideas on areas where you definitely want to see, other spots you can definitely skip. Other thing that's great about this route is that you can do it almost any time of the year, with the exception of Bryce, which will be miserable. You can do this route in the wintertime. It'll be cold, but not like dangerously cold. You're not doing Yellowstone and Grand Teton and the Badlands in January. And you can also do this route in the summertime, and it'll be hot, and it can be dangerously hot in a few spots, so do be careful, but you can do this route really almost any time of the year. And like I was saying at the beginning of the video, if you want to do an outdoors oriented trip, this is the one. It's the best one. You'll see just spectacular scenery all along the way. Some of the most beautiful stuff you'll see in the US, if not on the entire surface of planet Earth. So pack up your car, your tent, your camping gear, your hiking boots, and hit this route. I hope you liked this video. If you did, give me a thumbs up to let me know it was all right. If you like this kind of stuff, subscribe to my channel. I'm posting videos about travel, about road trips, about some geography stuff. So if you're kind of a nerd, you like to travel, check out my channel. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King signing out and about to go crawling through a cave.